lights won't change. Tell me they will stay the same. Where we go, 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 where we go.
We would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land of Australia and acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging.
That our culture is still alive, it's still present, it's still breathing.
I came that they may have life and have it abundantly.
You've got to slow down. Daddy is deep listening, silent, still awareness. You got to find your spirit. Because if you don't, you're just this being that's drifting through the life journey of yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to our Marist Symposium for 2021. My name's Tony Clark and I'm the Director of the Marist Formation Theme, and it's my pleasure on behalf of the Marist Association of St. Marcel and Champagne to welcome you and to welcome so many of you who have gathered here this afternoon. I know that I think we had almost 550 people register individually, but I also know how great it is that there are so many communities who are gathering together right across the country. And I know in communities also around the world. So wherever you are this evening or this morning, whether it be Vietnam or the Philippines, Alice Springs or Emerald, you are all very welcome. And it's great to see you here. Just at the outset, to welcome Father Timothy Radcliffe, from I know is coming from a very early and I think a still dark morning from his community at Oxford in England. And I think, Timothy, you were awake certainly before 4 o'clock, so I hope you've had a chance to have a strong coffee. But also to our Marist Brothers General Council, to members of the General Administration. So good morning to you all in Rome, but also to welcome Archbishop Peter Comensoli, Archbishop of Melbourne, and Bishop Mark Edwards from the Diocese of Wagga. Thanks for being with us. Just a note about our proceedings this afternoon. Father Timothy will address us and we'll have a couple of short moments just to catch our breath and then open for some Zoom chat and some question time. But to welcome Father Timothy more formally, I invite Brother Peter Carroll, the leader of the Marist Association, the Provincial of the Marist Brothers of the Australian Province and President of Catholic Religious Australia, to welcome Timothy. Thanks, Brother Peter.
Thanks very much, Tony. And wherever you are, welcome. I doubt that I need to introduce our presenter to you this afternoon. If you've joined this gathering, you've joined because you know and value Timothy Radcliffe and his writings. But for form's sake, a few items from his CV. Timothy is a Londoner, a priest, a Dominican. He's a thinker, writer and teacher, and has lectured in scripture at Oxford University. He is a preacher, presenter and leader, having served as provincial and then Master General of the Dominican Order for 9 long years. Some things you may not know about Timothy. His book, What's the Point of Being a Christian, won him the 2007 Michael Ramsey Prize for Theological Writing. He received an honorary doctorate of divinity from Oxford University, but that is only one of 11 universities that have conferred similar awards on him. He is a consultant for the Pontifical Council of Justice and Peace. He's patron of the International Young Leaders Network and a free man of the City of London. Quite an honour. And what we who gather today all know, I'm sure, is that Timothy is an engaging writer, a master storyteller, and an incisive commentator. His books and articles on Christian life, spirituality, the church, religious life, have helped enlighten people around the globe as they seek to make sense of their world and to find the sacred in everyday life. In fact, Timothy's most recent book, Alive in God, inspired our 2021 Marist Formation Theme, Breathe, Alive in God. Timothy, you are most welcome to this gathering today. Thank you for accepting the invitation to be our guide and our companion.
Good afternoon to you all. But as Tony said, it's actually very early in the morning here, but I have a strong cup of coffee, which I hope will keep me going. I'm reminded of a cabinet minister in England who at the beginning of the last century had a dream that he was addressing the House of Commons, and then he woke up to find that he was doing so. First of all, a big thank you to the Marists for having invited me to be with you today. When I was 6, I was sent to a Marist school for a year. And I remember the endless kindness of the teachers. And then I was handed over to the Benedictines. So I'm afraid it was downhill after that. I'd so wish I could be with you today, partly because I just enjoy being in Australia. I've been to Australia almost every year for the last 20 years. And we were always taught that you had nothing to say until you'd listened. So I wish that I could have been with you to listen, to hear what makes you laugh, except for jokes about poems, of course, and tune in to where you're at. So I hope it will not be like one of my brethren who gave a lecture in Chicago. And when he sat down, the applause was, shall we say, minimal. And he turned to the man beside him and he said, I hope it wasn't that bad, was it? And the man said, oh, I don't blame you. I don't blame you at all. I just blame whoever asked you to come and speak in the first place. Blame Tony. When I was a child, my great uncle Dick used to come and stay a couple of times every year. He was a Benedictine monk. He'd been a chaplain in the First World War. And he was famous for his courage, because every night he would go into no man's land to rescue the dead, bury the dead, rescue the wounded. And he was commanded to stop because they didn't think he'd last very long, snipers taking shots at him. But he disobeyed, typically of my family. He lost an eye. He lost most of the fingers on his right hand. He was deeply hurt in many ways, but for us, he was filled with life and joy. Even at the age of 90, we couldn't get him to go to bed at night. He would stay up, and my mother had to leave glasses of whiskey on the staircase to lure him up to bed. And he opened my eyes to a fundamental truth that I want to explore with you today, which is that everything in our faith is about being alive. Everything. Jesus said, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. And St. Irenaeus, 2nd century theologian, famously said, Gloria Dei homo vivens. The glory of God is a human being fully alive. So people won't understand what we're on about unless they get some glimpse of that deep, exuberant life. And let's face it, it's not always the first thing that strikes you about the Catholic Church. Being fully alive is not about being, the heart and soul of the party, clapping everybody on the back. It's the complex business of learning how to love, how to have friendship, how to cope sometimes with suffering or failure, but keep on going, growing through every crisis. So anyone who has insight into the complex business of living and loving is our ally in understanding our faith. Filmmakers, bloggers, novelists, painters, musicians, and it doesn't awfully matter whether they believe in God or not, as long as they open the window onto human life. There was a recent TV series in Britain, I don't know whether you saw it in Australia, called Normal People. It was based on a novel by Sally Rooney, and I enjoyed it enormously. It showed two young people getting over the wounds in their life and learning to love each other. And I can tell you it was the food for a few sermons. And I'm afraid some people were shocked because there was a lot of sex and there was nothing about religion. But it didn't matter. It opened a small window into the mystery of love. And that love, we believe, is God. The organizers of this conference called it Breathe, the Spirit of Life. And breathing is about as fundamental as it gets. The first drama of every human life happens about 10 seconds after our birth. The baby expels the liquid from its lungs and sucks in air. That's the beginning. Tim Winter, in his novel Breath, I try to quote Australians to show how enculturated I am, his novel Breath explores breathing. He says, it's funny, but you never really think much about breathing until it's all you ever think about. I consider the startled look on the faces of my girls in the moments after each of them was born and suctioned and forced to breathe in air for the first time. And then the average human being then breathes about 650 million times. And then there is the final dramatic moment, the last breath before death. I've been at so many deathbeds. Is this the last one? You wait, just one more, and then it's over. Unimpeded breathing is symptomatic of what it means to be alive. On May the 20th, May 20, when George Floyd was arrested and the officer stood on his neck, he cried out time and again, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. And these words have become emblematic of the oppression of Afro-Americans. And during this pandemic, we've become especially aware of our breathing. because our breathing can give us not only life, but death. For the first time in humanity, millions of people are wearing masks, especially in Europe. I don't see many signs of masks on the screen. I think in Australia, you escaped relatively well. And it's not surprising, therefore, that all the great religions have breathing at their core. In the Jewish Kabbalah, you have the 3 levels of breathing at each stage of the spiritual life. In Sufi Islam, there's the breathing exercise of zikr. I think it's, forgive me if I mispronounce that. And in Buddhism, of course, breathing is the central discipline of meditation. And Christianity is the tale of breathing in and breathing out. This is how it begins. Then the Lord God formed the earth being, which is what Adam means, the earthling, out of dust from the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living being. And God reveals himself to Moses in the divine name, I am who am. But in Hebrew, it is the sound of breathing. Ayeh, asher, ayeh. So that every time we breathe, the Jews believed, we call God by name. And on the cross on Good Friday, Jesus breathed out his last breath. And then on Easter morning, according to John, he breaks through the locked doors into where the disciples are hiding, and he breathes on them. Whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven. At Pentecost, you have the great wind. Word in Hebrew, ruach, means breath, wind, spirit. So all of our relationship to God is about breathing in and breathing out. What does that mean? Let's begin in this first bit with the first breathing. The second bit, we'll look a bit at the second breathing. It all begins with the baby breathing the liquid out of its lungs. Its first great yes to life. All of our lives, we go on breathing in and out, saying yes to life. Jeanette Winterton wrote, as I try to understand how life works and why some people cope with it better than others with adversity, I come back to something to do with saying yes to life, which is love of life, however inadequate, and love for the self, however found, not in the me first way that is the opposite of life and love, but with a salmon-like determination to swim upstream, however choppy upstream is, because this is your stream. So like the baby, we empty ourselves to fill our lungs with air. A certain emptiness, a certain dissatisfaction opens us to more. If we are complacent, smug, self-satisfied, we will not be open to fuller life. In the words of Shakespeare, we open ourselves to immortal longings. St. Augustine of Hippo said, show me a lover and he will understand what I'm saying. Show me somebody who wants something, someone hungry, someone wandering in the wilderness, thirsting and longing for the fountain of eternal home. He or she will know what I mean. But if I'm talking to somebody without any emotion, they will not understand. So we are hungry for life, God's breath. What does this mean? Well, it turned our first parents in the story of Genesis into gardeners. The first human vocation is gardening. God planted a garden in Eden, Genesis says, and the Lord God took the earthling and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and to keep it. Human beings are called not just to till the ground, grow vegetables, wonderful though that is, but to till and care for all that is. It says we are to have dominion over the Bible, over the earth. But that didn't mean, it was not understood to mean until very, very recently, that we can do with creation what we want. It meant that we were God's delegates in caring for all that lives. In the Bible, to be holy is to be alive. In one of the Eucharistic prayers, we say, you give life to all things and make them holy. Because to live is to belong to God. And today we see the lungs of the earth, the Amazon, clogging up with dirt, pollution, and smoke. Our little planet is becoming asphyxiated. I know the terrible desert fires you've had in Australia last year. The planet is struggling for breath, like somebody with COVID-19, while we argue about turning on the ventilator. Now, I think most of you are teachers. So let's ask for a moment what it means for you to be gardeners of the young, tending their holy lives. Schools are the seed beds of the next generation. St. Thomas Aquinas, 13th century Dominican, I can't give a lecture without mentioning him, otherwise I'd be in trouble. He saw the teacher's vocation as a sharing in the life of the one teacher, the Creator God. It's sharing in God's creativity, bringing the young to flourish. Though sometimes, of course, in moments of irritation, you may be tempted to suffocate them. So teachers are God's undergardeners. And Aquinas loved a saying by Aristotle: the soul is, in a sense, all things. We have a natural human capacity to open ourselves to other people, other ways of being alive, even in organic world. So education is leading people out of the constrictions of self-centeredness into the rich community of the living. It's much more than communicating facts. It opens the minds, the hearts of the young, like flowers unfolding in the spring. And we flower by a sort of self-forgetfulness. We learn to be astonished. All teaching is, if you forgive the oversimplification, all teaching is learning how to say marvelous. In the beginning, God looked at creation and he saw that it was very good, marvelous. All teaching is bringing the young into this marveling. When I was 8 years old, my English teacher was called Peter Wickham. Afterwards, he became well known as a translator of the rather naughtier poems by Catullus, but he didn't tell us anything about those. But when we were very, very good, he would give us a treat, which was to listen to Charles Dickens. So we came to believe that Dickens was fun. Dickens was marvelous. And we delighted in his delight in people. And so when I went home for Christmas and my mother asked me, what you want for a Christmas present, I said, 8 years old, I'd like a novel by Dickens, which my mother thought was a bit weird. But my grandmother, who is a very wise woman, she said, give it to him. He may not understand much, but he will begin to learn the music of the words. And Dickens opened me to the vast joy we can have in human beings, however eccentric they may be. My teacher expanded my soul. Forgive me if I'm being a bit oversimplistic. Blame it on the Benedictines. If only I'd stuck with the Marists a bit longer. But I would say that all teaching liberates us from the narrow constrictions of introspection into the vast and wonderful world of all that lives. That is our flourishing. That is the unfolding of our humanity. When I was a child, I struggled to learn French, and I was a dismal failure, as I was actually in most of my studies. Then in my 20s, I was sent to Paris for a year of study. I slowly learned French, but a lot of this was by becoming, in a way, a little bit French. I enjoyed going to the cafe, reading a French newspaper, Le Monde, having a cup of coffee or a little beer, smoking heavy Gauloise cigarettes, which I used to do in those days. They were disgusting, but it was a necessary part of pretending to be French. How pretentious. At least I stopped from wearing a beret and having onions around my neck. If I spent long enough in Australia, I would become a little bit Australian. Perhaps I already am. So all study is opening the heart, the mind, the soul, expansion. It's what Aquinas call latitudo cordis, the expansion of the heart. What about science? Well, it too opens you up to what is marvelous. Annie Dillard claims that the gift of seeing is the pearl of great price. She delights to look down the microscope or the telescope. Technology can help us to wonder. She said, learn to see what there is without the need to own it, pick it, stuff it, pickle it, photograph it. Just let it show itself. There is a kind of seeing that involves a letting go. When I see this way, I sway, transfixed and empty. Empty, and so ready for more. And she tells about a child who was given a telescope, a microscope, so that she could gaze at the jungle in a drop of water and be enchanted. But in the puddle or the pond, in the city reservoir, ditch, or the Atlantic Ocean, where the rotifers still spin and munch, the daphnia still filter and are filtered, and the copepods still swarm, hanging with clusters of eggs. They are real creatures with real lives, one by one. I can't pretend they're not there. If I have a life, sense, energy, so does a rotifer. So all teaching is the gardening of the minds of the young. It's a divine vocation. It's the first human vocation. When God breathes into the lungs of a human being and opens them to other ways of being alive, whether it's learning Spanish or history or astrophysics or studying the digestive system of a worm. We invite our students to step beyond themselves, out of their small world, and be free. We're liberated from what Iris Murdoch, the philosopher, called the fat, relentless ego. We invite people to wonder, and they teach us to wonder too. Emma Donoghue wrote a harrowing novel called Room. It's about a young woman in the States who was abducted and imprisoned in a shed, raped, and she has a child called Jack. And Jack believes that the only reality is the shed. And one day he escapes into the open air with all the colors and light and vibrancy and sounds. Education is helping the young to escape confinement and find their way into the glorious land of the living. and of inorganic things too. And faith does this even more radically. It opens the window of the heart and the mind to the oxygen of God's infinity. And it does this best with poetry. I think all faith in the end is poetic. If I may quote my own latest book, I hope you're all going to buy lots of copies of it. For Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, poetry summons us to richer, more humane ways of existing. He said, unroofed scope, knowledge freshening wind, ozone freshening your outlook beyond the range you thought you settled for. It blows holes in the narrow confines of my small world of the iPad, the iPhone, the iPod, I. So we'll take a break now. And in the final second section, I shall look at that second breathing in the Spirit, which makes us not only open the minds of the young, but teach them how to share God's loving forgiveness, his healing. But first, you might like to take a breather for a couple of minutes and ask yourselves, what is my gardening? How do I tend and care for life? Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and I hope you get a chance to catch your breath. And thanks, Father Timothy.
The first breathing of the divine breath makes us gardeners of all that lives. But everything went wrong, and the first gardeners started to consume the fruit rather than look after the garden. You could say consumerism had arrived, and the world is overwhelmed in distress and violence and death. But there is a second breathing of a new divine breath. There is a third, actually, at Pentecost, but the two is quite enough for one lecture. On Easter morning, John's Gospel tells us that the risen Jesus bursts into the locked upper room and breathed on the disciples, tells them not to be afraid. And he says, those whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven. And this launches a whole new, more radical understanding of the human vocation of our gardening. We don't just care for the living. We are all, every one of us, commissioned to bring healing and renewal. Every one of us is commissioned to help the dead wood flower and the barren to have life. We live in a pretty judgmental society. It is said everything is permitted, but nothing is forgiven. Our sins and failures are recorded on the World Wide Web forever. There is no absolution. If you ever tell a lie, and all of us do sometimes, you may be branded forever as a liar. Our world is heavy with accusation and counter-accusation, scorn, contempt. It is said that the Duke of Edinburgh was leaving his country estate after Christmas one year, and all these paparazzi were there, all with their cameras flashing. And he unrolled the window and he said, "Oh, you scum." To which one of the reporters replied, "Yes, sir, we are scum, but we are the creme de la scum." In this harsh world, every human being is commissioned, every baptized person especially, to bring words that heal and release, that let people go, to begin again. So we're called not just to care for life, but to help new, impossibly new life happen. We share in a little bit of the creativity of God, who raised Jesus from the dead and made the dead wood of the cross flower on Easter morning. My favorite TV series, I must confess, is called The West Wing. And in one episode, Liam McGarry, the White House Chief of Staff, who's a recovering alcoholic, tells a story. There's a guy walking down the street and he falls in a hole. And the walls are so deep he can't get out. And a doctor passes by and he cries out, "Hey, you, help me out." The doctor writes out a prescription, throws it down the hole and walks away. And then a priest walks by and he says, "Help, help, get me out of the hole." The priest writes out a prayer, drops it down the hole and walks away. And then a friend of his, Joe, walks by. He says, "Joe, help." And Joe leaps into the hole. And he said, "That's no good. We're both in it now." And he says, "Are you stupid?" "Yeah," Joe says, "but I've been down here before and I know the way out." This is the incarnation. God jumps into the holes we have dug and helps us find the way out. God is the great escape artist. Every one of us is called to help each other out of the holes that we dig. It can happen just in a smile or a nod, a hug. When I was elected Master of the Dominican Order, I have to say I was very daunted. Before I went to Rome, I visited an old Scottish Dominican. He was called Anthony Ross, famous historian, rector of Edinburgh University, and wait for it, a famous wrestler. When he tried to persuade the inmates of the local prison to take up an art, they used to mock him. He'd say, "Do you want to do painting, poetry, music?" And they would mock him. And he would then challenge them to a wrestling match. And he would always win. And when they were on the ground, he'd say, "Okay, which is it going to be?" And then he was struck down by a terrible stroke. And he could not speak, just a word. And I went to see him before I flew to Rome, and he could speak just one word: courage. And that one word was my nourishment, my strength for months. The first step in entering into this great human vocation, this divine vocation to forgive and to heal, the first step is to refuse to pass on the hurt. It stops with me. Antoine Léry, whose wife, Hélène, was killed in Paris by the terrorists in November 2015, wrote an open letter to her murderers. On Friday evening, you stole the life of an exceptional person, the love of my life, the mother of my son. But you will not have my hatred. I will not give you the satisfaction of hatred. You want it, but to respond to hatred with anger would be to give in to the same ignorance that made you what you are. You would like me to be scared, for me to look at my fellow citizens with a suspicious eye, for me to sacrifice my liberty for my security. You have lost. The violence stops here. This is what a friend of mine, Terry Eagleton, calls fruitful inaction. And its fruitfulness is that it opens the space for the next step, the emergence of the new, the dead ground flowers. A fellow Dominican and a friend was called Pierre Claverie, Bishop of Oran in Algeria. And his whole life was dedicated to dialogue with Islam, with his many Muslim friends. He liked to say, I have need of the truth of other people. And in the 1990s, Algeria was engulfed in violence. But because of his friendship for Muslims, he was a primary target. On August the 1st, 1996, he arrived back in Oran, in Western Algeria, after a visit to Algiers. He was met at the airport by a friend of his, a young Muslim friend, who's called Mohammed Boukichi, who he never asked people to drive him. It was too dangerous, but he was tired that night, so Mohammed came. And when they got back to Pierre's house, the terrorists were waiting. As they entered, they detonated the explosives that were built into the wall, and they were blown to smithereens. When I arrived for the funeral 3 days later, I found a sister still collecting their remains with a teaspoon. His funeral was attended by 1,000 Muslims, and his grave is always covered with flowers left by Muslims and Christians. And when he was beatified in Algeria with 18 other religious, the whole Algerian government turned up with us for the celebration. This would have been unthinkable a few years before. And that evening, there was a performance of a play written by a young French Dominican, Adrien, called Pierre et Mohammed. It was attended by Mohammed's mother, who at the end of the drama kissed the son kissed the actor who played her son. So that barren act of murder produced fruit, flowers. The friendship that led to Pierre's death has flowered in a deeper way than we could ever have imagined. Forgiveness is the ultimate gardening of the living. I walked in the Sahara after it had rained. I was astonished to see all the little plants springing up from the sand dunes, little sprigs of green. Forgiveness is the evergreen grace of God. As Isaiah said, the wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It shall bloom abundantly and rejoice and with joy and singing. Then shall the lame man leap like a hart, and the tongue of the dung sing for joy. For waters shall break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. That's our vocation. God's gardening of the desert of our hearts. And so the challenge, I think, for all of us, especially teachers and parents, is to raise kids who know the art of speaking healing words to others that give freedom from failure and oxygen. The hospitals of Europe are filled with COVID patients on ventilators, helping them to breathe. We offer each other the oxygen of life. And artists are our allies, and poets and filmmakers can be too. And since it's time to stop, let me offer just one final example: music. Music and song are one way to offer healing. It offers a hope beyond our words. The opera about 9/11, called Between Words by Tansy Davis, had its world premiere just over 5 years ago. And some people were shocked that anybody could write an opera about that awful, murderous day. But Nicholas Drake, the librettist, said that, I quote, "Putting the transforming power at the heart of the drama, we thought, might allow us to weigh the tragedy of what happened on 9/11 and discover some kind of light in the darkness." He said music even seems to have played a role in helping some people on that day. A security guard sang hymns to those descending the stairs to give them courage. Some relatives, lost for words as they spoke to loved ones on the phone, sang together. So may the divine breath fill our lungs so that we may become gardeners of life. First of all, opening the minds and the hearts of the young to all that lives, all that is, beyond the narrow world of self. But secondly, sharing in that divine creativity to heal, to set free, to forgive, to make new. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Timothy. And in this moment, we take and find some space just to look at another couple of questions. Not only what's resonating, but perhaps what are the challenges you see emerging, or even questions that are surfacing for you. And during the time, we'll invite you to make a comment or to pose your question in our chat. And to do that simply by clicking the chat icon. And then in a moment or two, we'll have an opportunity for some questions to Father Timothy. Welcome back. And we can see a number of hands that are raised, again with reactions, then raise your hand. And there's one, if you just unmute yourself and even say your name or where you're from.
I just wanted to, I loved your quote about music. I'm a musician and a teacher, and I think there's a tendency in our Western culture to overspeak and try to fill the silences. And I see that a lot in the kind of frenetic activity in schools these days, where if you're not talking or you're not busy, you're not worthy. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little about cultivating that contemplative space in a school environment or, you know, a busy staff, and how one actually, there's a, you know, that tacit kind of expectation that we're doing something, not just being together. So how do we nurture that contemplative space in our busyness?
First of all, I would say, Fiona, I'm extremely envious of you being a musician. I would love to have been a musician myself. And one of the reasons is, I think, as you will know better than I do, I think that a lot of music is a structuring of silence. They often say that really what's important is it's the silence between the notes.
Yes.
And in Ireland, a lot of schools have begun to introduce each day with times of silence. And they add a minute with every year that passes. So when you're 10, it lasts so long. And then when you're 11, it's a minute longer. And what they found is that actually the kids love the silence. And we have this rather, I think, I guess they're stupid, but I don't like saying that, but this narrow idea that unless a kid's being entertained all the time, it's going to be bored. Yes. And I've never brought up any kids, but from what I learned, and I've got many nephews and nieces, and I think that this is untrue. Yeah. I think children are, even at a young age, capable of silence, and they need it. I would say one of the most important things in my education was living in the countryside and going in the evening into the woods, just to be quiet, to listen to the birds. Our birds aren't as exotic as yours, but learning to listen to the cries of nature, yeah. The call of the fox and the badger. Of course, there was one question which links with this, perhaps I can teach it at the same time because it overlaps, is we do live in a culture of control, administration, management, where endless targets have to be met. And I think that this is very unhealthy. Charles Taylor, the Canadian historian of ideas, talks about the rise of the culture of control in the 16th century. Everything must be administered. And that is the dead hand, I think. Because a lot of education, I think, is learning to let go of some control and let what is unexpected happen. That's what Pope Francis goes on all about, all the time. For Pope Francis, the secret of spirituality is a certain letting go of control. Prayer is a letting go of control of your life, letting things be unpredictable. But I could talk for another hour, so I better stop, Fiona, otherwise Tony will intervene and cut me off.
No, thanks,
thank you for that.
And Kate from Kilmore was asking, was a very similar one about finding the spaces and looking at means to find routine in how we breathe the spirit. So I think that was taken up from Kate. Just had another question there, I think from David Hall. David, if you could unmute and pose your question to Father Timothy.
Father Timothy, thank you very much for such an inspiring and very moving lecture today. As I reflect on the whole notion of ego and calling young people out of the focus on themselves and ego, it seems to me that sometimes the trap of staying there is themselves having been hurt and not released through the healing. It seems perhaps in that regard, we're in a bit of a vicious cycle.
I think, David, you put your finger on something terribly important. Because we need to forgive, but often it's actually very tough. But you can't force the pace of forgiveness. Sometimes we have hurts. And let's face it, sometimes the church has hurt people in ways that we cannot say to them, okay, forgive. Forgiveness can take a long time to emerge, as long as the hurt is there. And so I think that we can't just say to people, you've got to forgive. That can actually feel like another form of abuse. What we can hope is that the moment comes. When Jesus was on the cross, he said, Father, forgive them. And I think there may be moments in our lives when we're really hurting, when I'm not at myself yet ready to forgive, but I can say, Father, forgive them. I'm not able to yet. I hope one day, but you forgive them. That's as far as I can get today. And I think that's all right. And I think we learn to have forgiving hearts slowly. We forgive the little things. And then when the moment comes, we may be given the grace to forgive the big hurts. Because we're all, in a sense, we bear wounds. And it's extraordinary, this risen Christ who bursts into the upper room. He shows them his wounds. He may be risen, he's still wounded. And in a sense, I think that's one of our great things that gives us hope, is that the risen Lord isn't some almighty Superman, Batman, celestial Batman. He's a wounded person. Actually, when it comes to think, Batman was too, but that's another lecture. So we bear our wounds and we bear our hurts, and we have to respect the hurts that lock other people sometimes in themselves. But our own hurts can actually prepare us to help others. There was a French Dominican who I greatly admired called Jacques Lavallee. He was a novelist. And he wrote a book which is called The Wounds, The Scars, I think. And he dedicated a copy for me, and it said, Timothy, you know that the wounds may become the doors of the sun. And I think we all have these wounds, and as kids have them too. Perhaps they aren't yet able to tell them. But even the wounds that they have may one day become blessings for other people.
Thanks, Timothy. And it's great to hear the bells of Oxford there this morning. Number of people commenting.
That's my community, summoning us all to prayer. I've got a good excuse.
Well, Timothy, we have a question from St. Teresa's community, if you're there, and just unmute yourself.
Yes, Michael here from St. Teresa's, Noosaville. I teach religion and study of religion, religion to the juniors and study of religion to the seniors, and teach our clientele. This is Australia, and the last census showed that 30.1% of people claim that they were of no religion. I think it reflects in the area that I live as well, probably all around Australia. My question is, looking for some tips and tricks how to teach, impart, Catholic faith and tradition and beliefs and philosophies to a clientele that is, increasingly secular. So could we get some help there?
That's a fascinating question, and you got more experience. Hi, hello. You got more experience than I have. I would say that often, I'm afraid you've disappeared from my screen. Often the problem isn't secularism. The problem is fundamentalism. I think we live in a very fundamentalist society, which is awfully inclined to oversimplification. Look at Twitter, the world of Twitterdom, where everything is reduced to a very small number of characters. So I would have thought, don't be afraid to introduce your kids, but you've more experience than I have. Don't be afraid to introduce them to nuance, to making subtle distinctions. Often we try to oversimplify our faith. We have a 2,000-year-old tradition of thinking, and it's rich and it's wonderful. You know, a friend of mine called Robert Barron, his niece went to university and he said, "What books are you taking?" And she said, "Oh, well, I've got a book on Einstein. I'm studying Shakespeare, the complexity of his language, and so on." And he said, "Well, what have you got on religion?" And she said, "Oh, they gave me a cartoon book." So I think we should not be afraid of the intellectual richness of our tradition. Our doctrine is liberating. It's releasing. So I would say the great thing is not to think we're in battle against secularism. I think we're in a battle against fundamentalism. And the fundamentalists can be economic. They can be religious fundamentalists too. Or they can be, you know, dry economic fundamental, whatever. And introducing kids into the delicious, glorious, intellectually challenging tradition from which we come is very important. And I could talk, let me give you a last clue. There is a film which bowled me over, and it was called Of Gods and Men. And it's a film about these Cistercian monks who were in Algeria, and they were caught up in the violence and they were killed. And I watched it 5 or 6 times. And it absolutely knocks your socks off. And when I came to Australia for 6 weeks, 2 years ago in Melbourne to talk to Catholic teachers for 2 years running, and to Adelaide the year before, I used clips from the film Of Gods and Men because it touches your imagination. I went to see it in Oxford, and the cinema was filled with students and faculty. At the end, we were all wrapped in silence. Nobody wanted to leave the cinema. We were totally captivated. So I would suggest that St. Teresa's, what you might do is think of films that you can show that really explore some of the mysteries of our faith. One other, I mean, Gods and Men is the best, I think, but there are lots and lots of others. Into the Great Silence, a fantastic exploration of life in a Cistercian monastery in France. Because it's the imagination that matters. That's why I wrote my book recently. It's inadequate in many ways, but I think the key thing is imagination.
Thanks, St. Teresa's, for that question. And I think we have one now from Matthew in Canberra. Welcome, Matt. If you might be on mute, we'll just check.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Father. Very provocative words about healing and forgiveness. Like in the UK, much of our church in schools, there's much harm done on because of much of the sexual abuse. And it would be true to say many of our parents and boys, and dare I say staff, it's been the last straw and given them very much permission to walk away from the church. How would you commence that conversation of healing so they can reopen that discussion in terms of our tradition of making Jesus known and loved?
It's an enormous question, Matthew, and it's one of the most important questions we face. 2 years ago, I was in Melbourne, and I gave a retreat for the head teachers of Catholic schools in the state of Victoria. And they helped me. And they gave me the most extraordinary quotation from a writer, an Italian writer, who, gosh, 50 years ago, faced the corruption of the church, faced it with open eyes. And, but in the end, he said, to whom else shall I go? Now, we look at our church, wounded, corrupt, failed. And perhaps the first thing is to say it's always been like that. I love the feast of Peter and Paul, you know, the patron saints of Rome. One denied Christ, Peter did, and Paul killed Christians at the beginning. Were founded on pretty odd rocks. And from the beginning, it was not the church of the great and the good, it was the church of pretty feeble, weak people, but who in the end, dared to give their lives. So how do we go on this journey? I'd love to find that quote, Matthew. I'll try and find it, and maybe I can send it to you via Tony. It'd help me. Thank you to head teachers in Victoria. But I think we only really begin the healing when we put the suffering of the abused at the heart of our lives. I still wonder whether we've succeeded in embracing, in really, really, really listening, in making their hurt really our own. And I think we only emerge out of the tomb. Well, to take up that image earlier, we only emerge out of the hole when we go into the hole in which they are and be with them. And if we dare to do that, then the Lord God may open the way out for them and for us with them. We're not going to find our way out alone. So I think faced with realism, the way that grace and forgiveness have triumphed time and again in the church over our feebleness. But if we listen and listen and listen with all our heart, all our imagination to the wounds that have been inflicted, to people who are hurt, then if we've the courage to do that, the Lord will open the tomb.
Well, thank you again, Matt and Marist College, Canberra. Just had another question come through from John Cullerton. John, if you're there, unmute yourself and just say where you're from.
Hi, Timothy. I'm from Penshurst in like the southern sort of suburbs of Sydney. A sort of good question, actually, to just follow on from what you said. I really like that anecdote you had of jumping into the hole and Joe sort of like just jumping in there without a plan sort of thing. I think it was a really good sort of expression of like what we're called to do, but how do you, maybe you can fill us in a little bit about how you yourself find that courage to kind of jump in? Because I know that's what we're called to do, but that's, I guess, the hard thing to do.
Well, I'm very lucky, John, because I live in a community of wonderful brothers and sisters. And, you know, some of us have got courage one day and some of us have got courage another day. None of us have got courage every day. And I think we take it in turns, don't we? Someday it'll be my turn to be the brave one who takes the risk of getting hurt. Other days it'll be somebody else. But if we cling together and we admit our fear, courage isn't being without fear. courage is not being the prisoner of our fears. Because if you're not afraid, you cannot be brave. And I don't know, we live in a macho society still in some ways, where we're afraid to admit that we're afraid. But the moment we do it, then I think we can give strength to each other. I'm reminded of G.K. Chesterton. He said, there should be a plaque erected, a tribute in honor of the first person who saw Stilton cheese and had the courage to eat it.
That's very true. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, John. And a question from Lisa Bright. And again, Lisa, you might say where you're joining us from this evening.
Sure, I'm joining from Parramatta. I work in the Diocese of Parramatta in pastoral planning. But just as a parent, I come from this as a parent. How can we encourage our children to find healing with themselves? Because I just know with my children, they they struggle with their own esteem issues and pressure to succeed that is placed on them. So they can't find life within themselves sometimes. So in terms of what you've been speaking about, how would you approach that with these young people who just struggle to find the opportunity to heal themselves?
I think as a parent, Lisa, you probably know more about this than I do. So could you first say what you think should be done?
At the moment, I suppose I hear what Pope Francis talks about accompaniment when we accompany each other. And as a parent, I mean, I struggle to think what to do, but the first thing I can do is to accompany my children and to be with them. Yeah. And that's all I can do, I suppose, to be with them and and walk alongside them.
And do you think, I mean, in my very limited experience, often play is so liberating, and kids do have an immense capacity to play, that ludic sense. And I wonder whether in and through play they can be liberated, because play demands a certain sort of self-forgetfulness. Is it Liza or Lisa?
Yep.
Do you ever play jacks? Did you never know the game jacks? Yep. You know, when you throw the ball in the air?
Yep.
A friend of mine, called a fellow Dominican, was in Peru, in Lima. And he was feeling a bit depressed. And he went for a walk in probably the poorest part of Lima. That's where he lived, a real slum. And he came across two kids. And they were playing jacks. But about 4 feet away, there was the corpse of a dead dog. But they were playing jacks and laughing. And suddenly he realized they were so poor, they didn't even have a ball. They were inventing the ball. So there in this darkest, gloomiest, smelly place, you had kids who were playing, inventing, like God. And I think if we can learn how to, I suspect, but I'm not a parent, Liza, you probably know more than me on this, but I suspect if we can discover how to play, we can liberate each other. In my experience of friendship, and friendship is absolutely key, I think, for the Christian life. It is a life of friendship. In my experience, we become truly friends when we learn to play. There's an ludic element, I think, in all profound friendship. And I think that is liberating. That sets us free from ourselves.
Well, thank you, Lisa, for that question. And we're moving just to our last couple of questions. And Again, if you have one to pose, please place that in the chat, or if you have other comments to make. But second last from Lee Stow. Lee, just again where you're from. Welcome. Lee, if you're there, you might be on mute or...
How's that, Tony?
I got you there.
Hello, Lee.
Hello.
I thought you'd gone to sleep.
Oh no! Last thing was I just had to get up and close windows because we've just got thunder and lightning happening here. I'm in Brisbane, Tim, so I've just had to make sure things are dry. So I'm back. Yes, thank you for this afternoon. I'm really pleased I was able to join, and I'm grateful for the invitation. I work at the moment with final year university students at one of our Catholic universities, and they are working, they're master's students who are working, wanting to get a sense of what it means to teach in a Catholic context and how that's distinct from teaching maths or science or, you know, economics in another good high quality education setting. So I'm actually called a companion in that journey with them, and I work with a small group for the whole year. And I'm just aware, I guess the question is, I'm thinking of them, but also the young people they teach in our secondary schools. And there are so many things, Tim, that are competing for that oxygen in their lives. And I really was taken by the idea of helping to teach our young people words of healing and words of release. How do we show them that that's worth pursuing? You know, how do we show them that's really the goodest of the good? All the things that are good and wanting and they should be taking into their lives, how do we raise that to something that they see is really worth pursuing for them, for their flourishing?
You see, it's interesting, Lee, that many students will say to me, I want to make a difference. And I think if you look at the young people that I meet here in England, in Britain, but also when I come to Australia and places, a lot of young people really want to make a difference. But I think the difference that they can make, if they can see that the healing words, the forgiving words, the creative words make a much more fundamental difference than anything that we can imagine. Because the people that they want to make a difference to, the people that they want to help, they are the children of God. They're not just victims, they are the children of God who themselves have immense capacity. I think always when you go to any meeting, in my experience, whenever I go to a meeting, I always ask myself, not what can I give, but what can I learn? And people have always something to offer you. If only we received the gifts they have. And then it's so exciting. When I was in Paris for that year, I was with a wonderful old Dominican, 80 years old, not much older than I am now, actually, and called Marie-Dominique Chenu, one of the greatest theologians in the 20th century. And even at the age of 80, he would go out every evening. He would go out for meals and lectures to artists, trades union leaders, anyone. And we would meet in the refectory at 10 o'clock at night, have a last beer. And he would say, what did you learn today? This is what I learned today. And if we go on, if we show our young people that they're at the very beginning of an endless life of learning, then they will be, we hope, excited.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tony, I was a bit worried. We had Alison earlier on and the sound never came right.
It did. I think with Kate and the community assumption, it was very close to the very first question that you began to unpack to them. So
they're all right, are they? I hate people.
I think they're okay. They did send a message to say that that was all good.
Okay, good.
So Timothy, our last question and the final comment from you will come from Bernadette Gibson. And Bernadette, again, you just say where you're from.
Oh, hello, Father Tim. I'm from Maitland, Newcastle Diocese, and we've embarked on a very ambitious program of rewriting our curriculum and running formation side by side with it. And it's all based on this idea of encounter. And I guess my question is around, you know, we have such a huge, diverse number of families that are sitting in front of our teachers and students that are sitting in front of our teachers who have needs from everything from that first proclamation through to catechesis. And so my question is around how do we breathe life into a genuinely liberating evangelization that creates these spaces for encounter, that assists our teachers to create that for our young people?
That's a lovely question to conclude with, Bernadette. I think at the heart of our Christianity is conversation, the art of conversation. Herbert McCabe, who's a Dominican, one of my great teachers, he always talked about the eternal, equal, loving conversation, which is the life of God. The Trinity is the eternal conversation of God. And when God becomes flesh and blood in a human being, it's somebody who was the master of conversation. I was talking a couple of days ago to formators in Toronto, Canada, and I took the example of Jesus having a conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well. It shouldn't have happened. It was an impossible conversation. He shouldn't have been talking to her, a man and a woman, a Samaritan and a Jew, and she was on her fifth husband, who wasn't her husband. But they have this impossible conversation. And I think the heart of evangelization, the heart of encounter, is how do you talk? How do you make conversation, which means speaking and listening, with the most difficult people? And that's so exciting. Do you know the best experience I ever had in my life as a teacher was going to Melbourne, Victoria, a couple of years ago, 2 years running. And every day I'd have about 200 to 300 teachers, 90% worth of that weren't Catholic. And I knew I'd got about 10 seconds at the beginning to engage them. Otherwise, the iPads would be out and I would be addressing a wall of blank faces. And it was exhausting, but goodness, it was fun. Because you had that challenge, those first few seconds, would there be an encounter? Or would boring old Father Timothy stand there and send them all to sleep? So I think the heart of evangelization is not what we say to them, it's how we engage in vibrant conversation, which, if it all goes well, should be fun. There was a famous Dominican preacher called Vincent McNabb, and he used to love arguments. And he used to preach in the open air at Hyde Park Corner. And he got into an argument, a long argument, with this woman. And at the end, she said, "Oh, Father McNabb, if I was married to you, I would give you poison." And he replied, "Yes, madam, if I was married to you, I'd take it." And I think it's having these amusing, playful conversation. That's at the heart of all evangelization.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bernadette and Father Timothy. Thank you indeed for such a vibrant conversation with you this afternoon. And I'm not sure whether the sun's up, so I know it's early morning, but a final word of thanks to you is from Dr. Frank Malloy, who's the Executive Officer of the Marist Association, but also the National Director of Marist Schools Australia, to offer a word of gratitude. Thanks, Dr. Frank.
Thank you most sincerely for your time and thoughtful, provocative presentation. As you've noted, many of our colleagues gathered this evening work in schools each day with our young people and experience the associated challenges, joys, and rewards of that special vocation. You've invited us and encouraged us to find new ways of being aware of God's presence in our lives. And it's my hope that in this time of Lent, your inspiration brings forth a renewed attentiveness to God that will flow into our daily work in Marist classrooms and ministries across the country. Thank you, Father Timothy. I also take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank the Marist Association's Mission and Life Formation Team for organising this symposium. In collaboration with Tony Clark, Mark O'Farrell and Nathan Ahern have been painstaking in their preparation and management of this online gathering. Special thanks also to Lindsay Franco for her care in ensuring we were all registered and suitably prepared for our time together. Whilst you are all to obediently remain on mute, please let us show our appreciation to Father Timothy and to the MLF team.
Well, thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Tony.
And thank you, Father Timothy. Just a final word from me. We'll have that recording to you from tonight in the coming days. But it was, you may know that the book Alive in God came to be written in part during Father Timothy's convalescence when he was recovering from cancer. And he just shared with me that it was at a time that the doctors said that it was probably unlikely that he would ever be able to publicly speak or teach again. Well, it wasn't to be. And so, thank God, Father Timothy, you found your voice. What a gift it's been to us and to everyone who's gathered here this evening. But thank you to everyone who's gathered to be with our Marist family. So finally, from me and from all of us here, good evening and God bless.
When I leave my lonely body, always remember.